Welcome to History 143. Before we begin talking about colonies, presidents, revolutions, or the United States as a nation, we need to take a step back and ask a much more fundamental question. What is the American past? Well, that might seem like an easy question, but the answer depends heavily on where we choose to begin the story. For a long time, American history was taught as a story that essentially began with European exploration and colonization. Columbus arrives in 1492, Europeans establish colonies, and the United States eventually declares independence. And the story continues from there. But there is a major problem with that version of the past. People were already here. And not just a few scattered groups waiting for Europeans to arrive. No, by the time Europeans reached the Americas, indigenous peoples had already been living on these continents for thousands of years. They had developed complex societies, agricultural systems, trade networks, political institutions, religious traditions, and cultural practices. So if we want to understand American history, we have to begin before America was called America. One of the most important ideas in this opening module is that there was never a single, quote-unquote, Native American culture. The Americas were enormous and environmentally diverse. Think about the geography of North America alone. There are deserts in the southwest, enormous forests in the east, grasslands across the Great Plains, mountains stretching across the continent, and Arctic environments in the far north. Different environments created different opportunities and different challenges. And indigenous peoples adapted to these environments in remarkably different ways. Our textbook divides the continent into broad geographic regions, including the West, the Heartland, and the Atlantic seaboard. But these aren't just geographical labels. They're designed to help us understand why indigenous societies develop differently from one another. In the Southwest, for example, people developed sophisticated agricultural communities despite living in an environment where water was scarce. In the eastern woodlands, abundant forests, river, and fertile land supported large agricultural populations. And in the Great Plains, many societies developed ways of life that relied heavily on hunting, particularly after the introduction of the horse much later into the colonial period. The important point is this. Environment influenced culture, but it did not determine it. People made choices, they experimented, they adapted, they traded, and they migrated, of course. But beyond that, they formed alliances and political systems. There was no single indigenous experience. There were thousands of communities, languages, traditions, and political identities. So let's take a step even further back. So, where did the first people in the Americas come from? Well, the answer is complicated like most things. And it is also a subject where historians, archaeologists, geneticists, and indigenous traditions continue to contribute to our understanding. For many years, the dominant archaeological theory suggested that humans entered North America through a land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age. This is often referred to as Beringia. As glaciers covered enormous portions of the planet, sea levels dropped, exposing land between Asia and North America. Groups of people moved into the Americas over generations. But the older version of the story, that migration happened through a single route and that these people immediately spread across the continent, is far too simple. Archaeological evidence suggests that human settlements of the Americas was much more complicated of a process involving different movements and routes over a very long period of time. And we should be careful here about treating archaeology as the only way of understanding this history. Many indigenous nations have their own traditions concerning their origins and relationships to the land. These traditions are not simply alternative versions of a European historical narrative. They represent cultural systems that they have their own meanings and significance. That becomes particularly important when we begin working with the primary sources for this week. By roughly 2500 BCE, many indigenous communities had developed increasingly complex societies. The transition away from highly mobile hunting and gathering did not happen everywhere at the same time. Some communities continued to move seasonally, following animals or taking advantage of different food sources. Others increasingly relied on agriculture, and some did both. This is an important pattern throughout indigenous history. There was no universal path towards quote-unquote civilization. European historians sometimes assumed that societies followed a predictable progression, hunter-gatherers into farmers, into cities, into civilization. But indigenous history doesn't fit neatly into that model. But different societies organized themselves according to their own environments, needs, and cultural values. By the period leading up to European contact, indigenous North America contained an extraordinary variety of societies. One of the most important things to understand that there is no single model of what an indigenous society looked like. Communities organize themselves according to their environment, available resources, traditions, population size, and historical circumstances. Some groups remained relatively small and mobile, moving seasonally to take advantage of hunting, fishing, gathering, or other resources. Others became more settled and developed substantial agricultural communities. Some constructed enormous earthworks and ceremonial centers, while others developed sophisticated systems for managing water and cultivating crops during difficult environments. Still, others participated in extensive trade networks that connected communities across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. This diversity is important because older interpretations of Native American history often present indigenous societies as though they existed along a single spectrum from simple to advanced. Well, that framework reflects a European understanding of social development rather than the realities that we find in indigenous history. A society did not have to construct a large city or establish a centralized empire to be sophisticated. A community that developed an intricate understanding of its environment, created systems of trade and diplomacy, or organized itself around complex kinship relationships was demonstrating a different kind of social complexity. Indigenous peoples developed solutions to the specific challenges they faced, and these solutions varied considerably from one region to another. This diversity becomes even more apparent when we expand our focus beyond what is now the United States. In Mesoamerica and South America, indigenous peoples developed some of the largest and most complex civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Maya, for example, developed major urban centers, sophisticated writing systems, mathematical concepts, calendars, and extensive astronomical knowledge. Their civilization was not a single unified empire, but consisted of numerous city-states and political communities that interacted through trade, diplomacy, warfare, and cultural exchange. Farther north, the Aztec Empire established political dominance over a large portion of central Mexico. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was a massive urban center built on an island in Lake Texcoco, supported by an extensive agricultural and water management system. In South America, the Inca Empire created an enormous political system stretching across much of the Andes. The Inca developed roads, administrative systems, agricultural terraces, and methods of organizing labor that allowed them to govern a vast and geographically challenging territory. It is important to recognize that these civilizations did not exist in isolation. The Americas contained extensive networks of trade, migration, warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange long before European arrival. Goods, technologies, ideas, and cultural practices moved between communities. People interacted with their environments and with neighboring societies in ways that continually reshaped their communities. In other words, the pre-Columbian Americas were not static. They were dynamic places experiencing political expansion, conflict, cooperation, technological innovations, environmental challenges, and cultural exchange. This is one of the major ideas I want you to take from this section of this course. The history of the Americas did not begin with Europe. When Europeans eventually arrived, they entered a world that already had thousands of years of history behind it. The arrival of Europeans would drastically transform that world, but it did not create the world in the first place. The North American Southwest provides an excellent example of how indigenous peoples adapted to challenging environmental conditions. The region includes large areas of desert and semi-arid landscapes, where water is limited and agriculture can be extremely difficult. Yet, indigenous communities developed sophisticated ways of living in this environment. Among the most sophisticated and significant were these societies that we commonly refer to as the ancestral Puebloans. The ancestral Puebloans developed settled agricultural communities that relied heavily on crops such as corn, beans, and squash. Agriculture in the Southwest required considerably more than simply planting seeds. Communities needed to understand seasonal weather patterns, manage limited water supplies, and select appropriate locations for settlement, and develop methods of storing food for periods when harvests were less reliable. In some areas, indigenous farmers developed irrigation systems and other methods of directing water towards agricultural fields. Their success demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of both agriculture and the environment. One of the most important archaeological sites associated with these societies is Chaco Canyon, located in present-day New Mexico. Chaco became an important center between roughly the 9th and 13th centuries and contained large structures, sometimes called great houses, that required significant amounts of planning, labor, and resources to construct. The scale of these buildings and the organization necessary to support the community challenge the outdated idea that indigenous societies in North America were small, isolated groups with limited political or technological capabilities. Chaco also demonstrates another important feature of indigenous societies: connection and exchange. Archaeologists have discovered evidence suggesting that Chaco was connected to communities across a much larger region. Materials such as turquoise, shells, pottery, and other goods moved through regional networks. These connections remind us that indigenous communities were not necessarily isolated from one another. They participated in systems of trade and communication that would extend over considerable distances. At the same time, we should be careful about the way we talk about places such as Chaco Canyon. It is easy to look at an archaeological site and think that people who built it as it belonging entirely to the distant past. We see the buildings, imagine the people who constructed them, and then we move on to the next chapter. But indigenous history did not simply disappear when particular communities migrated or when settlements were abandoned. Cultures change, people move, and political systems reorganize. Communities respond to droughts, conflict, resource shortages, and other pressures. The fact that a particular settlement declined does not mean that the people themselves disappeared. Many contemporary indigenous communities have deep historical and cultural connections to those who lived throughout the Southwest for centuries before European colonization. And this is an important habit for us to develop as historians. We should not confuse cultural change with disappearance. Indigenous people are not simply people who, quote unquote, used to live here. They are part of an ongoing history that extends from the ancient past into the present. If the Southwest demonstrates how indigenous societies adapted to an arid environment, the eastern woodlands provides a different example. This enormous region, stretching across much of the eastern portion of what is now the United States and Canada, contained forests, rivers, wetlands, fertile soil, and, of course, abundant wildlife. These environmental conditions provided indigenous communities with a wide variety of resources, and many societies developed agricultural economies while continuing to rely on hunting, fishing, gathering, and, of course, trade. Agriculture became particularly important in the eastern woodland societies. Beans, corn, and squash, often referred to as the quote-unquote Three Sisters, formed an important foundation of indigenous agriculture. These crops worked particularly well together because they provided complementary nutritional and agricultural benefits. Corn could provide a structure for beans to climb, while squash spread along the ground and helped retain moisture and suppress weeds. Together, these crops provided communities with a reliable source for food. But it would be a mistake to assume that the development of agriculture meant indigenous peoples simply became farmers and abandoned their older ways of life. Hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants, and trade remained important. Indigenous communities developed economic systems that combined multiple sources of food and resources. This flexibility was particularly valuable because environmental conditions could change from year to year. A successful society was not necessarily one that relied on a single resource, but one that could adapt when the circumstances changed. The eastern woodlands were also home to some of the most politically sophisticated indigenous societies in North America. One particularly important example is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes referred to by the European term, the Iroquois Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee brought together several distinct nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, with the Tuscarora joining later, through a political and diplomatic system intended to establish peace and cooperation among them. And before we go too much further, I want to apologize. I often joke that the most difficult part of history is pronunciations, and someone like myself often struggles with that. So if you hear me mispronounce something that you know is pronounced differently, please just know that I am trying my best. Now back to the lecture. This is actually where our first primary source, the Great Law of Peace, becomes particularly important. Rather than simply reading the document to determine what happened in the past, we should approach it as evidence in how these people understood their political and social world. As you read the Great Law of Peace this week, I want you to ask several questions. What does this source tell us about political authority? What responsibilities do leaders have to their communities? How should disagreements be resolved? What should the source suggest about the relationship between individual communities and their larger political alliance? And perhaps most importantly, what does the source reveal about what the society considers necessary for maintaining peace? I also want you to consider your own assumptions while reading it. Most of us have grown up with the particular understanding of what government is supposed to look like. We tend to think about presidents, legislatures, elections, constitutions, political parties, and courts. These institutions are familiar to us because they are part of the political systems that we live in. But historical thinking requires us to temporarily step outside of those assumptions. The question is not simply, does this look like American government? The better question is, how does this society define government, leadership, responsibility, and political community on its own terms? That distinction is extremely important. We are not studying indigenous political systems to determine how closely they resemble modern American institutions. No, we are studying them because they provide evidence of the many different ways human societies have attempted to organize political life. And that brings us back to one of the central themes of this module. There was no single path towards complex society. Indigenous peoples developed many different ways of organizing communities, economies, political institutions, and relationships with the natural world. Those systems existed long before European colonization and continued to evolve after the Europeans arrived. Understanding that diversity gives us a much stronger foundation for everything that follows in this course. When European colonization begins to reshape North America, we are not watching civilization arrive in an empty or undeveloped continent. No, we are watching one set of societies encounter one another. Societies that already had their own histories, institutions, cultures, and political traditions. That distinction will become increasingly important as we move into the next modules and begin examining European exploration, colonization, and the creation of what would eventually become the United States. As we continue looking at the diversity of indigenous societies, there is one assumption that we need to particularly be careful about. The idea that agriculture was somehow the measure of whether a society was quote-unquote advanced. That assumption has influenced the way historians have traditionally described indigenous peoples. Communities that practiced intensive agriculture and established permanent settlements were often portrayed as more developed, while societies that relied on hunting, fishing and gathering, or even seasonal migration were described as less sophisticated. But that interpretation tells us more about the values of the historians making that judgment more than it does about the people they were studying. Agriculture was one strategy for meeting the needs of a community. It was not necessarily the best strategy everywhere. In some environments, intensive farming simply did not make sense. The availability of water, soil quality, the presence of particular animals and plants, seasonal weather patterns, and the mobility of resources all influenced how communities organized their lives. A society living in an environment with abundant game, fish, or edible plants could develop a successful economy without depending heavily on agriculture. For many indigenous peoples, hunting, fishing, gathering, and seasonal migration were highly sophisticated ways of life. These communities developed an incredibly detailed understanding of their environments. They needed to know when particular animals would migrate, where fish could be found at different times of the year, and which plants were edible or medicinal, when weather patterns would change, and how to move through their environment without exhausting the resources upon which they depended. This knowledge was accumulated over generations and passed from one generation to the next. Now, think about what that actually requires. A community that depends upon hunting cannot simply wander into a forest and hope to find food. No, successful hunting requires an understanding of animal behavior, seasonal movement, geography, weather, and terrain. Likewise, communities that rely on fishing need to understand waterways, seasonal cycles, and the behavior of different species. Gathering wild plants also requires knowledge of which plants are useful, where they grow, when they can be harvested, and how they can be prepared. That is a tremendous amount of environmental knowledge. Seasonal migration could also be a highly organized process. Moving from one location to another was not necessarily random or chaotic. Communities often had established patterns for where they would go, when they would move on, or what resources would be available in particular locations, and how they would interact with neighboring communities. Mobility could actually be an advantage because it allowed people to take advantage of resources as they became available, rather than trying to force the environment to produce those resources in one permanent location. This is especially important when we consider the diversity of North America. The Great Plains, for example, presented very different opportunities than the forests of the eastern woodlands. The Pacific Northwest offered enormous quantities of fish and other marine resources. Arctic environments required entirely different survival strategies. There was no single economic system that could work equally well across all of these regions. And that brings us back to the important idea from earlier in the lecture. Geography mattered, but geography did not determine everything. Indigenous peoples were simply not passive victims of their environments. They were experts in them. They learned how to work within the environmental conditions around them and developed cultures that reflected that knowledge. Sometimes that meant cultivating crops. Sometimes that meant building irrigation systems. And sometimes that meant following herds, harvesting seasonal plants, fishing rivers, or moving between different environments throughout the year. So, when we encounter a society that did not practice intensive agriculture, we should not automatically ask, why weren't they more advanced? We should ask a much better historical question. What strategy did the society develop for hunting and thriving in the environment it inhabited? That shift in perspective allows us to see indigenous societies on their own terms, rather than measuring them against a European model of development. So at this point, we have spent a lot of time discussing geography, agriculture, economic systems, political organization, and adaptation. But understanding those things only tell us part of the story. We also need to ask a much more personal question. What were indigenous societies actually like? Well, again, the immediate answer is that there was no single answer. There were thousands of indigenous communities throughout the Americas, each with its own traditions, languages, political structures, religious practices, and social expectations. We should therefore be very careful when we make broad statements about what Native Americans believed or Native American society. Those phrases can be useful as general categories, but they can also hide enormous differences between individual societies. At the same time, historians can identify certain themes that appear repeatedly across many indigenous communities. One of the most important is the significance of relationships. For many indigenous societies, a person's identity was closely connected to family, kinship, community, and, of course, the natural world. An individual was not necessarily understood as an isolated person whose primary responsibility was to pursue his or her own interests. Instead, identity could be deeply connected to one's relationship with other people and with the broader community. And that brings us to our first major topic in this section: kinship and marriage. Family was much more than a private relationship between parents and children. Kinship could determine where someone belonged within a community, who they were responsible for, who they could marry, and how property or resources were passed between generations. And it could even influence how political alliances were formed. In societies where formal governments might look very different from the governments we are familiar with today, kinship networks could provide much of the social structures necessary to organize a community. Marriage could therefore serve purposes beyond the relationship between two individuals. It could strengthen relationships between families or communities, establish alliances, create obligations of mutual support, and determine the status of identity for future generations. And again, there was enormous variation. Some societies traced descent through the mother's family, while others emphasized the father's family. In some communities, extended families lived together or remained closely connected across generations, while in others, social organizations followed different patterns. Again, the important thing is to not memorize one universal definition of indigenous family life. Instead, recognize that kinship was often an essential part of how indigenous communities organize society. We also need to rethink some of our assumptions about gender when studying indigenous societies. One reason this can be difficult is that many of the descriptions we have of indigenous communities were written by European observers. Those observers naturally interpreted what they saw through the cultural assumptions they brought with them. If a European traveler saw women performing agricultural labor, for example, he might interpret that work according to European ideas about women's statuses and assume that women were being forced to perform work that should have belonged to men. But that interpretation may tell us more about the European observer than the indigenous community. In many indigenous societies, work was divided according to gender, but a division of labor does not automatically mean that one gender was considered inferior. Different forms of work could carry different types of importance and authority. Women in many communities played major roles in agriculture, food production, household organization, child rearing, and the transmission of cultural knowledge. Men in many societies were more heavily involved in hunting, warfare, and other activities. But these divisions were neither universal nor rigid. They differed significantly from one another, and individuals did not necessarily fit neatly into these categories. In some indigenous societies, women also possess significant political and economic authority. The Haudenosaunee provide an important example. Women's roles within that community could give them substantial influence over political leadership and decision making. This is particularly important because it challenges the assumptions that indigenous societies simply reproduced European patterns of male political dominance. Once again, however, we need to avoid replacing one stereotype with another. The goal is not to argue that indigenous societies were universally egalitarian or that women always held more power than European women. The goal is to understand that indigenous societies developed their own ideas about gender, labor, authority, family, and responsibility. So, as you encounter these societies within the readings, resist the temptation to ask, was this society like modern America? Because it wasn't. Instead, ask, how does this society define responsibility? How did it define authority? What kinds of work were considered important? How were family and community organized? Now, those questions allow us to study indigenous societies historically rather than simply comparing them to ourselves. Another area where our modern assumptions can create problems is religion. One of the biggest mistakes we can make when studying indigenous spirituality is the assumption that, quote-unquote, religion existed as a separate category of life in the same way that many modern Americans think about religion. We often think of religion as something that happens in a church, a synagogue or mosque, or other religious institutions. For many of us, we try to separate religious belief from politics, economics, family life, and, of course, our relationship with the natural world. But for many indigenous communities, those divisions were not nearly as clear. Spirituality could be deeply integrated into everyday life. Relationships with ancestors, animals, plants, landscapes, seasons, and the natural world could all have spiritual significance. Rituals could reinforce relationships within a community and connect people to traditions that extended back through generations. This is one reason why our primary resources for this week are so important. You will be reading selections from the Popol Vuh and the Navajo creation story. These are not simply stories that we are reading because they are interesting examples of mythology. They are historical sources that provide evidence of how, particularly indigenous peoples, understood the world around them. When you read a creation story, you are being given an opportunity to see how a society answers some of the most fundamental questions human beings have asked throughout history. Where did the world come from? Where did humans come from? What is the relationship between human beings and the natural world? What responsibilities do we have towards one another? And what makes a community? And beyond that, what makes someone a good or responsible member of that community? These are not simply religious questions. They are also historical questions because the answers reveal something about the values and assumptions of the people who preserved those traditions. As you read the Popol Vuh, for example, think about what the story suggests about creation, humanity, and the relationship between humans and the world around them. When you read the Navajo creation story, consider what it reveals about movement, relationships, order, community, and the process through which the world becomes recognizable and meaningful. And again, I want to emphasize something here. Do not read these sources simply to identify what indigenous people, quote-unquote, believed. Read them to understand how the people who preserved these traditions understood their world. That is a subtle but important difference. Again, we are not judging whether a creation story is scientifically accurate. We are asking what that story tells us about the people who told it, preserved it, and passed it from one generation to the next. And that is exactly what historians do with sources. If we step back from everything we have discussed so far, we can begin to identify several broad themes that appear across many indigenous societies. Again, these should not be treated as universal characteristics of every indigenous community, but they do provide useful starting points for understanding the social values emphasized by many of these societies. Communities mattered, kinship mattered, reciprocity mattered, and relationships mattered. Reciprocity is particularly important. At its simplest, reciprocity refers to an expectation that relationships involve mutual obligations. If someone helps you, you may be expected to help them in return. If a community provides resources or protection, members of that community have responsibilities to one another. Social relationships are maintained through an ongoing exchange of responsibilities. Now, this can be extended beyond immediate family relationships. In many indigenous societies, individuals were understood as having responsibilities to a larger community and to the natural world around them. Now, that does not mean that indigenous peoples universally believed in some modern concept of environmental conservation. we need to be careful about projecting contemporary ideas backwards into the past. Indigenous people hunted animals, cleared land, burned landscapes, and transformed their environments just as other human societies have. But many indigenous traditions emphasize the importance of maintaining relationships between people, community, animals, ancestors, and, again, the broader natural world. The environment was not simply an unlimited collection of resources existing for individual exploitation. Political authority could similarly involve responsibility. A leader was not necessarily understood simply as someone who possessed power over other people. Leadership could involve obligations to maintain community stability, resolve conflicts, protect resources, and preserve relationships. But, and again, this is an important qualification, we should not romanticize indigenous societies. Indigenous people were not universally peaceful. They still fought wars. They competed over resources. Political alliances formed and broke apart. And communities experienced internal disagreements, social inequality, environmental disasters, and, of course, periods of violence. Now, this matters because there are two common stereotypes that we need to avoid. The first stereotype portrays indigenous peoples as primitive societies that were somehow waiting for Europeans to introduce civilization. The second portrays indigenous peoples as universally peaceful, perfectly egalitarian communities living in complete harmony with nature. Neither stereotype is historically useful. Indigenous peoples were humans living in a complex society. They made decisions based upon their circumstances, values, and interests. Now, sometimes those circumstances led to decisions producing cooperation and peace. Sometimes they produced conflict. Now, the goal in studying Indigenous history is not to make Indigenous people fit into a particular moral story. The goal is to understand them as historical actors. Now, this brings us back to the question in which we began this module. Where does American history begin? If we begin the story in 1492 when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue as he crossed the Atlantic, we are telling one version of American history. If we begin thousands of years earlier, we're telling a very different story. In the first version, European arrival can look like the beginning of American history. In the second, European arrival becomes an important event within a much older story. That distinction is not merely academic. It changes the way we understand almost everything that follows. When Columbus arrived, he did not arrive in an empty world. When English colonists established Jamestown, they did not simply settle on untouched wilderness. When English settlers established Plymouth, they entered a region inhabited by indigenous peoples with their own political relationships, economies, traditions, and histories. And when the United States eventually expanded westward, it was not moving into an empty continent. It was moving into territories that indigenous peoples already understood as home. And that's why the way we define the beginning of American history matters so much. Throughout this course, you're going to be encountering familiar stories. Columbus and European exploration, Jamestown and Plymouth, the American Revolution, westward expansion, and the Civil War. In the second half of this course, the one after 143, we take that a step further, tackling industrialization, immigration, and eventually the emergence of what we know as the modern United States. But I want you to continually ask a series of questions as we move through these stories. Whose story are we telling? Whose voices appear in the historical record, and whose voices are missing? And honestly, who gets to define what counts as America? But perhaps most importantly, what happens when different societies have fundamentally different ideas about land, government, property, religion, family, and community? And those questions are going to follow us throughout the entire course. So, as you work through Module 1, I don't want you to think of this as simply a chapter about what happened before American history. This is American history. The people of North America did not exist in some kind of historical waiting room, waiting until Europeans arrived. They had already been here for thousands of years. They had developed communities, political systems, economies, and agricultural practices, trade networks, religious traditions, and cultural identities. They experienced periods of growth and decline, conflict and cooperation, environmental change and adaptation. They cultivated crops, they hunted and fished, they traded across enormous distances, They constructed cities, settlements, earthworks, and political institutions. They developed systems of diplomacy and governments. They fought wars and they negotiated peace. They created stories that explained their place in the universe. And they passed knowledge from one generation to the next. The last point is especially important for our work as historians. Much of what we know about the distant past comes from written documents, archaeological evidence, oral traditions, material culture, and other forms of historical evidence. Indigenous societies preserved their histories in ways that did not always fit European expectations about what a historical source should look like. That means we will have to be willing to expand our understanding of what counts as historical evidence. Your primary sources this week give us an opportunity to do exactly that. Rather than simply learning about Indigenous people from a textbook or this lecture, these sources allow us to examine traditions that communicate ideas about community, power, nature, family responsibility, and humanity's place in the world. As you read, don't just look for facts. Look for values, look for assumptions, look for ideas about community, power, nature, family, and responsibility. And most importantly, remember the central lesson of this first module. American history did not begin with Europeans. The American past is much older, much more diverse, and much more complicated than that. And if we want to understand the United States that eventually emerged, we have to first understand that many peoples, cultures, and histories that already existed here. And that is where our story begins.